Today, I have the honor of introducing a very familiar face to us all. She is an ecologist who's interested in fish conservation and in sustainable use. And she joined SAIAB in 2018, joining Olaf's team. And then after her time here, she went and joined the team at Kruger National Park, where she's currently based. Today, she'll be presenting to us work that she has been doing in Laos on the Tiny Beam Fund. So bring your hands together to welcome Josie Pegg, and she will be presenting to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's so nice to see so many of you, and also some new people who I don't know. But yeah, I'm going to talk about some work I've been doing over in the beautiful country of Laos for the last well, I've been working out there for a couple of years now. It's a sort of funny old state of the world where you can work somewhere now for a few years without actually visiting, but I was actually out there earlier this year finally. Yeah, so I generally don't work in aquaculture. I most of my work is in sort of wild fish management, conservation, and a little bit of sort of capture fisheries work. Many years ago when I was in the UK, I did a bit of work with trout aquaculture, but I'm not an aquaculture specialist. I know over in DFFE we have some people that are proper aquaculture scientists, but I'm not. But I sort of got interested a few years ago. I was involved in a piece of work where we were looking at stress in fish. And I was working with a team in the UK. We were looking at stress, and we were looking at salmon and carp that were kept in, the salmon were being cultured in aquaculture facilities. The carp were being kept in really high intensity sport fisheries. And we were looking at how much stress those animals in very unnatural situations were experiencing. And when we measured their stress responses, actually they were far less stressed than wild animals. Within the wild populations we surveyed, we had animals that were far more stressed than those that were sort of in these really sort of intense sort of capture fisheries and aquaculture facilities. And we had a couple of theories for that. Obviously we weren't testing why, but partly we were thinking this was because a lot of their needs were met. They had unlimited food, they were free from predation, but also the process of breeding sort of domestic strains probably selected for individuals that cope better in those situations. Anyway, that was another piece of work, but it made me sort of think about what we might perceive an animal experiences versus what it actually does, and whether, you know, aquaculture, an animal in an aquaculture situation is actually having an experience that is positive or negative. And aquaculture, I'm guessing that everybody that works with fish has seen this figure. It's from the FAO State of the World's Fisheries 2024, showing how aquaculture production is increasing so much at the moment, whilst capture fisheries have sort of plateaued, both in the marine and freshwater environment. I'm going to be talking about freshwater, just because that's what I know about. I'm going to be talking about my work in Laos through a lens of what value it has to us here in South Africa. And that's not to say that I don't think there's still space here in South Africa for work optimizing capture fisheries. but that's just not the focus today. So just for clarity. I also feel for transparency, I should talk about who my funder is for this work. I've undertaken this work under a Tiny Beam Fellowship. Now, the Tiny Beam Fund is a philanthropic fund. They are based in the United States of America, and their remit is to help to understand and address problems associated with industrial food animal production around the globe, with a focus on low and middle income countries, and with a purpose of finding ways to address those problems. So as a funder, Tiny Beam, I think you could say they are skeptical of industrial agriculture, in this case aquaculture. However, I think it's really important to say this talk is not designed to be anti-aquaculture or anti-development or even anti-industrial aquaculture. The purpose of this research has been to look at what could come and to think about how we can develop truly sustainably. And I think it's really, it's really relevant at the current time here in South Africa. These two ladies are both members of parliament. They're both in the ANC. They come from my side of the country. They're members of parliament for Limpopo and Mpumalanga. I include these ladies because at the moment, the draft aquaculture bill is stumbling through Parliament. The draft bill was published in 2023. So we're now in 2026. And at the last published report of parliamentary discussions by the group working on the aquaculture bill, there was still a lot of debate about moving forward with the bill. Now, there's various, I think, political issues. There are certain technical issues. For example, one of the sort of challenges of the bill is what parts of the aquaculture bill otherwise are covered by other pieces of legislation. But there are questions being raised, including by these two ladies, that are specifically about the sort of sustainability of aquaculture. For example, Mam Bilankulu has been asking very sort of legitimate questions about what are the environmental impacts going to be about the scaling up of aquaculture, and what processes and rules would need to be in place to prevent ecological damage by this aquaculture development. Mam Makuena has been talking about if the purpose of scaling up aquaculture in South Africa is to reach foreign markets, how do we ensure that the people benefiting from these new markets are South Africans who are being uplifted by the sort of increase in aquaculture, and not candidates who are already, doing well under the present system. So there's questions here now. This was published from March of this year. Are members of parliament raising questions about sustainable aquaculture? So I haven't particularly been looking at South Africa, although I have obviously for comparative purposes, but I've been looking to Laos. Now, why Laos? Well, firstly, I've been working there already for some years, but also I think it's a really nice comparator. Asia is a real aquaculture superpower, but unlike some of the countries which are very developed in aquaculture, Thailand, Vietnam, Laos is quite an interesting country in that it is still very much developing its aquaculture. So whereas in South Africa, if we're looking at inland aquaculture, it's pretty small. In Laos, it's very much growing, but it's not capped out yet. And there's sort of this very similar rhetoric about the benefits of growth and expansion, benefits to people, benefits to the economy, and this sort of emerging industrialisation. Whereas here, I'd say in freshwater, not really the case. So it's not the same situation. There are some big differences. Laos, for example, has much more water than we do here in South Africa. But in terms of sort of social demographics, for example, Laos has a similar level of food insecurity to a lot of Africa. It has some relevance to look at this country as a further step along the aquaculture development trajectory. So what I actually was doing under this fellowship was looking at a few different aspects of aquaculture development. So looking at development pathways, looking at actor groups who was actually involved, looking at environmental and fish implications of development, looking at policy, looking at investment, looking at sort of the structure of development of both sort of aquaculture fisheries in Laos, but also of the sort of growth and development. So for those of you that haven't been lucky enough to go to Laos, and I would really recommend it, it's a very beautiful country. It's also got a currency where you can take your rands and still have quite a nice life, which is rare and lovely. But anyway, so what does aquaculture look like there? Well, the majority, in terms of number of aquaculture producers, the vast majority of aquaculture production looks something like this. It's ponds, it's species like cyprinids, tilapia and Pangasius catfish. And the ponds are mostly associated with small-scale agriculture. So either rice farming or sort of as part of a multi-trophic aquaculture system, so grown alongside poultry or pigs, for example. And the ponds and the houses and the farms are all sort of very integrated. So it's a fairly small scale, not very intensive, and fairly low cost, low input sort of scheme of production. And it's mostly a household which, amongst the sort of various means they both produce food and income, also produce fish. But then there's the next sort of step up in terms of aquaculture, and that's cage farming. Now, I'll scoot back a sec. Okay. This border between Laos and Thailand, down to about there, is mostly the Mekong River. So there is a huge river running along the border of the country. And as I say, it's a fairly wet climate. There are a lot of river environments there. And along the rivers, there is cage production, largely of, again, Pangasius catfish. And these have certainly been considered to have increased in numbers in the last sort of 10 to 20 years quite substantially. The white sacks in this, and again, you can see it's not highly technical, but it is fairly intensive. So the white sacks in that image are all bags of feed. So there's quite a high feeding level associated with this mode of fish production. And again, this tends to be business. It's a aquaculture business rather than a sort of family grow, eat, trade type scenario. And this has been sort of the, I guess, sort of organic in-country growth of aquaculture in Laos. But then more recently, and just sort of going into production in the last couple of years, is Pangasius Park and associated entities. Now, Pangasius Industrial Park is a huge modern recirculating aquaculture fish production facility. It's in the southern part of Laos. The size, it's over 28,000 hectares. And if you're trying to picture how big a facility that is, if you've been to the wilderness lakes, if you can picture the entire wilderness lake system, all the lakes within wilderness, that's about 2,800 hectares. So this is an enormous facility producing Pangasius fillets for the Chinese market. So this is a facility operated in Laos, but producing and selling to the Chinese. So it is entirely about production to China, funded with Chinese money. And they're talking about producing at capacity. Their goal for production at capacity is about 500,000 tons per annum. It's not quite there yet. Okay, so what does industrial freshwater aquaculture look like in Africa? We don't have it. We don't have anything like Pangasius Park here at the moment. However, I would say that it's easy also to sort of slightly underestimate what aquaculture production here might be. This guy, I don't know whether you can see, he's a runner. Again, he's a fellow Mpumalanga resident. He comes from Dahlstrom. He's part of the Dahlstrom Roadrunners. And if you can see his race vest, it's a rainbow trout PE kit. And I really feel like when I'm racing, I love these guys' team colours because they're a rainbow trout. But Dahlstrom is a trout producing region. It's in the Highveld of Mpumalanga. I don't think you'd look at any of the trout producers in Dahlstrom and say, oh, that's industrial level. But when you are looking at a community where fish production is at such a level that other aspects of community identity is linked to fish production, it's also difficult to argue that it's, you know, just a small scale family entity. So I think trout probably is the best example. If you look at some of the facilities over in the Western Cape, it's fairly sort of large scale. So I think, you know, yeah, we don't have Pangasius Park, but do we have growth of small scale production beyond it being small scale? I'd argue yes. And if you're thinking something like Pangasius Park wouldn't function here in South Africa, if I drive, well, I wouldn't because Kruger Park's the way, but if I was able to drive about 100 Ks into Mozambique, some of the large-scale freshwater aquaculture facilities there being run by South Africans would definitely be considered sort of industrial scale. So with this bill, with the desire to develop aquaculture, I think we'd be quite naive to say, well, it's not a South African issue. Okay, so my funding was to look at risk and problems and what we should worry about if aquaculture develops. So the first thing I was looking at was environmental impact. Things like eutrophication from nutrient input, other sort of chemicals, toxins and things coming out of aquaculture. And clearly there are effects. The effects are well studied. Now, literature from South Africa, very limited, but literature from Africa, comparable climates, is present. So the risks are known. I looked at different methods. So for example, pond versus cage versus recirculating system. And whilst some, the impact might be more dispersed, I think dependent on the input, the output tends to be the same. What I would say was the sort of main findings that were of interest was when it comes to scale, scaling up obviously increases the amount of effect. But I think one of the risk areas is when you have scaling up, not in a Pangasius park, but in multiple small but growing clustered facilities, it's very difficult to perhaps it's possible to underestimate the sort of effects that these individual facilities combined produce. I think the other thing that certainly is a big issue in Laos is antimicrobial resistance. So the use of antibiotic in these facilities. Now, the more fish you keep in a small area, the more contact they have, the more risk of disease transmission, simply as a result of epidemiology. And the more use of antibiotics is required to keep systems healthy if other aspects aren't maintained perfectly, things like water quality and so on. There is a higher requirement for good husbandry. The more fish you have, the more industrialized the process is. But in studies coming out of Laos, not only is there sort of antimicrobial, so antibiotics being found coming out of fish, there's also antimicrobials, antibiotics in the flesh of fillets that are being sold for consumption. So certainly in Laos, that's one of the sort of aspects that are an issue. The other is that these environmental impacts are seen or measured variably depending on which parts of Laos the work that the facility is or the monitoring is being undertaken. And good monitoring reduces the sort of environmental impacts of aquaculture, not because it reduces the environmental impacts, but it controls the behaviors that cause environmental impact. And that was very variable dependent on where in the country the facility was. And again, if we look at South Africa, perhaps up in my side of the country, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, there's a lot of interest in aquaculture. So maybe we do better in our monitoring than other places, maybe not. But certainly from Laos, the two sort of real issues coming out were monitoring is more of a determinant of impact than actually the intensity or the system used. The next thing I was looking at was fish welfare. And this was quite an interesting cultural experience. As part of my work, I carried out a literature review. I was looking at sort of academic literature. I was looking at a lot of grey literature. I was looking at things like newspaper articles and opinion pieces. And I was also talking to a lot of people in both countries. And I'd ask questions about, animal welfare. Is fish welfare a concern? And South African interviewees would generally say, oh, it's something we're mindful of, but, practically it's very difficult, or, there was an acknowledgement and but. When I was talking to people in Laos, they were like, what are you talking about? Like, they're fish. And it was a really sort of different cultural experience. Now, that's not to say that I think Laos has quite a caring culture. Laos is a Buddhist country. It has I would say, quite a caring culture, but I also think that care is very different to what I would say, I guess, the sort of Western driven view of aquaculture or animal aquaculture is. I think in Laos, the idea of unnecessary harm or wastefulness or lack of care for a common resource are all things that are considered bad. Whereas I think in South Africa, what we think about as welfare is somewhat different. It's sort of like rights of an entity. I may disagree, but that was certainly my perception. And I think, again, if we're looking at increased industrialization or increased production, particularly with a view to export, I think the global north is increasingly thinking about welfare. And whilst fish welfare has been some years behind perhaps land animal welfare, again, I think we would be naive not to have this as a sort of item of concern. Now, in terms of how that actually would function in, say, legislation, South Africa, obviously, we have animal welfare legislation. There is nothing specific to aquaculture. Laos, well, when I was doing research in Laos and I was asking for their ethics so that I could use it for my ethics here, they were like, oh, ethics, well, we've decided we should do this work, so it's ethical for us to do it because we're experts, which is efficient, but it's quite difficult when you then have to publish that work. I don't think you can write that in your ethics statement. So and again, this is not a critique of the way things operate in Laos. It's an observation of how something like a culture underpins the treatment of the animals. But again, if we're talking about export, if we're talking about having a global product, for example, there's a need to be mindful of global norms, perhaps. But then if we're talking about welfare, I think it's also really key to talk about welfare of people. Again, coming back to a lot of the debate about the Aquaculture Bill. And I think, it's, if you're interested in sort of development in South Africa and, the sort of the challenges of development, a lot of the debate has been around, recognition of transformation in the bill and so on. But one of the sort of big rhetorics about aquaculture, and this goes way up to the FAO, is that it improves food security. And I think one of the things that has really struck me about this is that that's just a myth when it comes to industrialization. That industrialization is about profitability. It's about making money from a resource. And yes, it's a resource that is eaten, but if it is being sold as a sustainable development goal, that's not actually the reality. And these are just a couple of pictures of Lao. This is just a picture I took. This is actually a seafront looking onto the Mekong. So this is quite a nice, pleasant part of town. I quite like this old building, but it's you can see the wiring, you can see the buildings. This is a sort of typical seafront housing in Vientiane, the capital of Laos. This picture is the railway station of the Lao-China railway, also in Vientiane. It's got all the quantums. It felt home from home, but it is an insanely enormous building. It is one of the biggest buildings I've ever been inside, and it is so different to the rest of the city. And this is built by Chinese money, it's Chinese development, and it facilitates movement of Chinese people, business in and out of Laos. And I think, you know, going back to sort of some of the comments that are being made in Parliament about the Aquaculture Bill, it's this idea of, if you are saying that something is for development, if it is sustainable development, then how are you ensuring that that people that are starting, for example, new aquaculture businesses, or that are growing a small business, are truly benefiting, and it's not the industrial complex with their railways and, you know, large parks that are actually the ones that are really making the money. And also, I think if we're talking about, you know, this, I don't want to say myth of sustainable development, food security, but it kind of is. It's also talking about how development funding is facilitating, effectively facilitating sustainable aquaculture development, and how it isn't. There is, you know, there's not free money everywhere in the world, but there is money for sustainable development. There's been money going into Laos, there's been money coming into South Africa to develop aquaculture. And sometimes this has been effective and has genuinely aided development, sometimes it hasn't. There is a couple of examples. There's a really nice, and I won't talk in too much detail, but if any of you have been to Harip, the China-South Africa aquaculture demonstration facility, it was built by the Chinese. There's a whole thesis written by a student called Pete Sheltlow from UNISA and their supervisor, looking at the various ways it was a failure, because it's functional. You can go there, they are producing some fish, but it never really was a hugely successful intervention compared to the amount of money that was spent. And there are various reasons for that, but a lot of the reason was it was built by Chinese using Chinese equipment and Chinese components. When you drive along the drive, there's a whole bunch of broken lamps, and it's because the lamps were Chinese fit lamps. So when they broke, they couldn't be replaced by South African lamps. So now there's broken lamps on the drive-in. And when you look at it, it's really quite a disappointing entity, because it should be like a really great facility, but it isn't. And it was made for South Africa, not with South Africa. Now, in Laos, there have actually been some really successful interventions. For example, the Japanese funders had a scheme based on core farmers, and they took farmers who were already managing small aquaculture facilities, and they trained them up as super skilled local farmers, gave them facilities, for example, to produce fingerlings. They did that. They were then hubs in their own communities, and sort of reviews of that project showed that it worked really well. So, you know, I'm again, I don't particularly work in the human side of fisheries, but I think it's impossible to talk about sort of sustainable aquaculture development without talking about sort of human aspects. So just coming up with sort of some, yes, take homes. What can we learn from Lao? I think that a lot of the potential risks are entirely predictable. Environmental risks are predictable. Economic risks are predictable. I don't necessarily think that there is a need to, you know, dwell on what those risks are. But I do think that there is a need to truly incorporate those risks into policy and planning and financing to minimize them. And then part of my Tiny Beam fellowship was actually to come up with research areas that should be going forward. And again, this has been a bit of a change of direction for me. I did some work 2024. I was working for the Swedish government looking at their eel management strategy. And I was part of a team of 5 expert reviewers of their eel management strategy. And there were 5 of us on the panel. 4 of us were fisheries scientists, ecologists, managers, and we had 1 social scientist. And this social scientist was quite angry the whole time that there was 1 of him and 4 of us. And he said, you know, if you're actually coming up with a management plan, then there should be parity between the biological scientists and the social scientists. And those of us that were the sort of biological scientists were like, well, this is a biological, ecological management issue. We know what we're doing. Now that I've done this, I've come up with what I think are probably the 4 big research questions, and 2 of which are sort of social, so I guess I'm wrong. But we can all learn and grow. And I think that the things that I would say I think are missing in terms of a research direction. Firstly, I think we know what outputs come from fish production, nutrient outputs, antimicrobial outputs. What I think is perhaps missing is longitudinal studies, large-scale studies that look at how these change over time and about how multiple smaller facilities contribute to a large effect, not a in and out equation, but a sort of holistic whole picture look at what's going on. I think there is a huge need to study welfare in tropical freshwater fish systems. Welfare is awful hard to study in fish. It's hard to study in animals. It's really hard to study in fish. But I think we're going to get left behind in Africa, in Asia, if we're not doing that. And I think our tropical systems or subtropical systems or temperate systems are not those that are being studied by research in the global north, which is often temperate. And then I think there's sort of two elements that are more sort of social science, and that's actually looking at the political economy of aquaculture investment. You know, again, this is not a anti-China talk, but it is what's going to come out from that Chinese investment and how is that impacting Laos, South Africa, and so on, or any other country. And then better data on equity outcomes. You know, again, who is actually growing their aquaculture, and you know, how does that link back to economic growth and food security? And there's nothing wrong with economic growth, and food security is also a desirable outcome, but let's not pretend that growth in aquaculture is meeting sustainable development. I have written a briefing note on this. There are some errors in this version, but if you want to look at it, you could find my mistakes, including my own name, which there was concerns about getting my name wrong. No, I've got my own name wrong. It's fine. So, but as a working draft, this is what I've been working on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josie, for the nice talk. Interesting change from South African stuff to see the international scope of the work that we are doing and how SAIAB is actually influencing the world at large. So do we have any questions on the floor for Josie?
Thank you, Josie, for your talk. My question is around, given that there are impacts of aquaculture development to the environment. So what lessons South Africa can learn from Laos in terms of balancing food security and economic development with protecting the diversity? And my second question is around the policy making. I like that you mentioned that there are females and they are also asking relevant questions. But at what stage do scientists come or become involved in policy making, especially with the proposals or the draft that are being submitted to the parliament?
Okay, I'll start with the first question, which was about balancing pollution and production. Yes. So I think there's two things going on. So firstly, I think monitoring is a big one. And the other one, I think, and again, I think there's a lot of really great work going on in the whole of Africa about this, about looking at sort of production under like a One Health umbrella. So if we're talking about that balance of, you know, for example, using feeds, antibiotics and so on, and then, you know, actually, you know, not stopping it, because I think that's what's got to come out of this. Like, this is, I'm not going to say, oh, you shouldn't be doing this because it's polluting. I think it's thinking, well, if you are, what is an acceptable level? So for example, antibiotics. If you are using so many antibiotics that it is measurable in the fillet, that's too many antibiotics. So what level of antibiotic is acceptable? And then if you cannot produce fish using just that level of antibiotics, what then do you do to improve your fish welfare that those are not required? And there's an organization called AFIWEL, which is the African Fish Welfare Organization. It's actually funded by the One Health Development Initiative. And a lot of their work is looking at training methods of fish production that are good welfare standards, good water quality standards, good management monitoring standards that ensure healthy, happy fish, but also fish production. So I think that's perhaps one of the, really good example of sort of African sort of initiatives that are actually trying to do that are trying to upskill producers to be able to produce fish whilst minimizing these negative impacts. Now, AFIWEL is, they're very active in some countries, they're more active than others. In Kenya, they've actually just, I think it's either in Parliament or the Ministry, their sort of One Health approach to fisheries and aquaculture is actually, at governmental level. I don't think they're quite there in South Africa, but they are active in South Africa. And so, yeah, I'd say there are initiatives like that. In terms of how scientists sort of influence policy, the draft bill was open for comment. When governmental bills come out, there is a consultation period. I assume it's now closed. To my knowledge, it's now closed because the bill was some years ago. I could be corrected on that. But I think, for example, one of the really nice, in fact, it was published posthumously, but it was something that Olaf was working on when he died, was after the publication in 2021 of the freshwater inland capture fisheries, he convened a meeting of scientists and they published a paper, 10 questions for the new inland fisheries policy. And that was a meeting of South African scientists with some international experts to say, well, where do we as scientists look at this piece of legislation and then produce the scientific information to facilitate it in this country, and that was what was done then. So maybe that's something we need to do now.
So in other words, it's the politicians that draft and then the scientists comment on that.
Yes, but it's an iterative process. But at the moment, yeah, this bill has just taken a really long time to go through. Well, not really. I mean, they all take a long time, but this one does seem, certainly if you look at the discussion around it, people are getting quite frustrated. Yeah.
Yes, Francesca.
Thanks so much, Josie. Given that link that you made as an observation in Laos to have fish aquaculture close to agriculture, what is the appetite, or is there any popularity or uptake in hydroponic where there is kill basically to birds with a stone or something?
Yeah, I mean, I think here in South Africa, there's probably more of an appetite. In Laos, they certainly fish amongst the rice paddies. That's quite a big, because the fish, I think, are quite useful because they both fertilize the paddies, but I think they're also quite good in like pest control. So they certainly are sort of farm in the rice. Certainly here, even around here, there's some quite nice sort of recirculating, and actually some of the sort of slightly bigger producers in Gauteng have these sort of circulating sort of tilapia vegetation RAS systems, which, I mean, if they work, are, again, if we're talking about sort of low outputs, they're fairly low output systems. And actually, I think, in the freshwater realm, we're probably a little bit behind some of the really like large scale work that the marine guys are doing, either, sort of co-farming shellfish alongside finfish or algae alongside finfish. I think there's probably I think it's one of those areas where if you're talking about minimizing sort of environmental effect, it's probably a really sort of nice circular way of doing it. I think the only, I would say, negative to that is that the risk of failure is then a multi-level failure as opposed to a multi-level success. So perhaps that might be a limiter.
Mir?
Thank you for your time. According to your experience from Laos, have you seen any water resource management which are useful in South Africa or other places that are facing water management issues and water issues?
So Laos has much more water than we do here. It is a much wetter country. I would say in terms of management, in many ways, we're probably better here because of scarcity of resource than they are there. Certainly, I think when you look at, for example, their sewage infrastructure and things, even you might go, ours is not that good. I would say it was probably better. In terms of certain things like philosophy towards like litter pollution, I would say there is probably better than here. And again, I think that's probably a cultural thing, you know, and again, this is one of the things I talked when I was talking to sort of producers here, you know, I was, you know, talking about things like, you know, keeping ponds, you know, clear of litter and stuff. And, you know, that there was comments to the effect that, you know, people don't have good, you know, refuse removal in villages. So if you don't have good refuse removal in your village, then putting your rubbish into a stream is not, you know, an act of carelessness. It's a way of removing a problem. Whereas, for example, in Laos, things like, you know, refuse removal, even in rural areas, is significantly better. Now, that's not a aquaculture issue or a water issue even. That's a sort of more systemic, high-level community management issue. But I think that's certainly one of the, you know, one of the things when I spoke to people like, you know, small-scale development in, you know, areas in South Africa, you know, they're like, well, are people not going to use it as a dump? Possibly. So how do you solve that where you create alternatives? So perhaps that's an area. But I'd say that there's just more water there. But things like, I mean, what I would say here is things like, you know, farm dams, for example. If we're talking about things like, you know, environmental impact, well, a farm dam is not a natural system here. It's already a man-made system. So whilst you wouldn't want to create a scenario where it's polluted, also it's probably a system that could be utilized with less argument against than, say, using a river system.
Okay, thank you, Josie, for the talk. I think this is still a very interesting topic. She'll be still around. If you have any more questions, you can just have a chat with Josie. So let's put a round of applause together to thank her for a talk. About 12 people online. Just like about 12 people. It's been hours.
Just no. I don't know.
That's why
Yeah. That's the way I question. I don't know. It's sort of facilities that is valuable, but also like. That's what it's all yeah. Probably cheaper. Yes.
I was just thinking when you were talking.
Yes.
They have all the water.
Yeah.
They have a very big rate wasting market. Which is very difficult to all the millions of South Africa. I don't know if they have the market. Definitely, it's also not. So, in your opinion, to try and get it to that level when we've already figured out making chickens at a very low cost, very low impact. Because anyone can start a chicken business.
Yeah.
But aquaculture, I don't in the South African context.
Yeah.